Representing the entire city, this is BCFM. BCFM 93.2.
Now, Martin, on to a little look around the world and what's been going on this week, particularly, I suppose, hotspots of various sorts. And before we hear from Henry Kissinger talking about the East-West divide and the new Cold War, what are your thoughts about where the hotspots are this week?
Well, obviously, I think the Ukraine is potentially the most dangerous hotspot on the planet because of the potential for a confrontation between Russia and NATO. But of course there's lots of other things going on. Syria is still a crying shame and a mess, and that is linked to what's going on in Ukraine because the Russians are on the West are on opposite sides of that.
Well, I'm going to give you something to think about now because the Defence Secretary Philip Hammond has been talking a lot about the threat from Russia this week, so let's have a listen to what he had to say.
We are now faced with a Russian leader bent not on joining the international rules-based system, which keeps the peace between nations, but on subverting it. President Putin's actions, illegally annexing Crimea and using Russian troops to destabilize eastern Ukraine, fundamentally undermine the security of the sovereign nations of Eastern Europe. The rapid pace with which Russia is seeking to modernize her military forces and weapons, combined with the increasingly aggressive stance of the Russian military, including Russian aircraft around the sovereign airspace of NATO member states, are all significant causes for concern. So we're in familiar territory for anyone over the age of about 50, with Russia's aggressive behavior a stark reminder that it has the potential to pose the single greatest threat to our security, and hence continuing to gather intelligence on Russia's capabilities and intentions will remain a vital part of our intelligence effort for the foreseeable future. It is no coincidence that all of our agencies are recruiting Russian speakers again.
Well, I find this extremely tendentious. They want the Russians to be the enemy, and they're going out of their way to make them our enemy. But unlike the height of the Cold War, Russia is a democratic country, and you could argue in many respects that Putin is a more democratically elected leader, and he's certainly got more popular support in his country than many Western politicians. I mean, George Bush was re-elected twice. In both occasions, in my view, on a thieved ballot, where the ballot boxes were, or the equivalent of ballot boxes were hacked and messed around with. The Russian democracy is, in fact, in better shape than democracy, for example, in Greece, where people can vote for who they want, and then they're told what to do by the European Central Bank, the IMF, and the European Commission. I think this talking up Russia as an enemy, we ought to be regarding Russia as a potential partner in resolving the various crises that we face, not least the economic crisis. How intelligent is it to try and deliberately crash the Russian economy when the German economy is largely dependent on the Russian economy? So the Americans are pushing for the Russian economy to crash the German economy so that they can be top dog in the world. This is very tendentious, very dangerous. The Russians are behaving very calmly considering the provocation they've been under, because don't forget that the coup in Kiev this time last year was carried out by elements within the new regime who are extremely violent, probably carried out the shootings of the protesters, the shooting of the MH17 airline. All the evidence suggests that was carried out by aircraft from Kiev. In other words, the Russians are being set up here. If we were dealing with Khrushchev, they probably wouldn't try and push them around in the way they are. And this demonisation of Putin is also completely silly. If Putin was to die tomorrow, somebody else would take over, but the policy would remain the same. My favourite person to take over would be Putin's advisor, Sergei Glaziev, who is Putin's brain. Now, Putin's a pretty clever fellow. Glaziev is a really clever fellow. And if the West wants to play poker with him, then that's what they'll get if they got rid of Putin, or possibly Zyganov, head of the Communist Party, which is the biggest opposition party in Russia. Although you wouldn't believe it from the way the Western media reports things over there.
Now, when Vladimir Putin made his State of the Nation address, which I suppose is, I don't know whether in the Soviet times they did this kind of thing, but it was headlined, "Remember the lessons we taught Hitler." That was December last year. He was saying things like that the West would have gladly applied the Yugoslav scenario to dismemberment and disintegration for Russia back in 1990. They failed. We did not allow them to do that. He also said for centuries Crimea was part of Russia. The peninsula is ethnically Russian, not just Russian-speaking. However, in 1954 it was transferred to Ukraine by Nikita Khrushchev, who believed national boundaries were irrelevant and that they all come within the banner of the Soviet Union. He also talked about the US and EU trying to play up the effect that sanctions imposed on Russia are having within the country, when in fact the low price of oil is the real reason for that. We were just talking about that, for the ruble slide. Putin says Russia is looking for new partners in the East for trade and believes the West's aim to hurt Russia will be detrimental to them in the long run.
Well, the people who are going to lose out from a confrontation with Russia are the Europeans. But of course, it's the US that's pushing for a confrontation with Russia because they hardly do any business with Russia. So it's countries in Eastern Europe in particular that are going to suffer from this. And of course, you've seen the questions are now beginning to be asked about whether this is a sensible policy. Angela Merkel has said she rules out categorically arming the Kiev regime. Nevertheless, the Americans and the British keep banging the war drum and saying that they are going to arm the Kiev regime. Now, what could happen here, ultimately, is that Germany will split with the US over this. That's probably what should happen. NATO is an organisation which has long passed its useful functions, and it should basically be abolished. And we should set up a completely different security structure where we're working cooperatively with the Russians to deal with mutual problems. And we're so far away from that now, it seems like a joke to mention it.
Another in the Putin State of the Nation address last December was, he said, our US friends, whether directly or from behind the scenes, always affect our relations with our neighbours. Sometimes it's unclear whether to talk to the authorities of the country or to their US patrons. He also said if for many European countries sovereignty and national pride are forgotten concepts and a luxury, for Russia true sovereignty is an absolutely necessary condition for our existence.
Well, I mean, he's putting his finger right on it there, isn't he? And this is exactly what the problem is. I think the Europeans will be extremely stupid to be dragged into a war with Russia to suit the neoconservatives in the United States of America. And it may be that they've just overplayed their hand to such an extent that we could end up in 2 years' time with the breakup of NATO, along with the breakup of the European Union, possibly.
Well, you mentioned the European Union, and we had last weekend the EU Commission chief making a case for a European army. This is in the EU Observer. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker has said the EU should establish its own army to show Russia it is serious about defending European values. In an interview with Die Welt am Sonntag, Juncker said Europe has lost a huge amount of respect in foreign policy too. We don't seem to be taken entirely seriously. An army would allow the EU to react in a credible manner to threats of peace in a member state or in a neighbouring country.
Well, this is interesting because I think what's going on here is essentially a signal to the Americans. The Americans and the British are opposed to having a European army. They think NATO is what it's all about. So Juncker suggesting a European army is actually undermining NATO. But of course, we don't really need a European army to fight the Russians. We need to actually cooperate with the Russians. We shouldn't be fighting with them at all. So in other words, we're getting ourselves into a complete mess because we're pursuing entirely the wrong policy. And I come back to what happened in Kiev this time last year. The transfer of power was not a legitimate transfer of power, and it looks very clear to me that the snipers which actually killed the protesters and the police officers which led to the coup were snipers associated with the far right in the Ukraine and probably associated with NATO intelligence services. Now, in other words, NATO goes around bombing things, blowing things up, and then blaming others for what they have done, and then trying to start wars on the back of it. And we've actually got evidence going back decades now of NATO's terrorist infrastructure in places like Turkey, Italy, Belgium, etc. Ultimately, terrorists have to be confronted. And that means, effectively, we're going to have to smash the Western intelligence services because they are the primary promoters of terrorism on the planet, including Islamist terrorism. They are the main sponsors of it.
OK, before we go off the subject of Russia, this came up in Parliament this week, and on Today in Parliament I was listening to on Radio 4, and up popped this chap called Rory Stewart, who's the chairman now of the Defence Committee, also a regular invitee to the Bilderberg conferences. He is one of the people who's very much pushing an increase in defence spending, even though we're living in an age of austerity, and we're going to hear from him now.
The Conservative chair of the Defence Committee, Rory Stewart, said both reviews had relied on two assumptions.
Firstly, that the Cold War has ended. So if you read the National Security Strategy, it says again and again throughout that strategy, the Cold War has ended, we need to be much bolder about getting rid of Cold War capacities. And secondly, that essentially what we will be doing in the future were the kinds of things that were happening in 2010, primarily Afghanistan. So absolutely central to the SDSR was the idea that what we need is something called enduring stabilization operations. That basically meant that we were planning to go in for a very long time with very large number of troops into a single country, or at most in the US planning, 2 countries at a time.
And now he's saying, actually, we may have a confrontation with Russia on the cards.
Well, the reason why they're pushing a confrontation with Russia, and Rory Stewart is very much an insider, he's been at the Bilderberg conferences and all the rest of it, is because they can't actually solve the economic problems of the West. And therefore, what will happen if we do get into an armed confrontation with the Russians, and there is then a stock market crash, the stock market crash will be blamed on Putin. But of course, it isn't Putin's fault if the US and British stock markets crash.
But isn't it more that they actually don't want to solve the economic problems?
No,
that actually what's happening is
they can't.
Well, what's happening is a lot of wealth is being funneled away from savers and from the poor into the hands of the rich.
Well, indeed, and ultimately that's
why should they want to stop that?
Well, no, they don't want to stop it. But what's happening is one of the biggest wealth transfers in history through the manipulation of the financial markets. The Russians are very well aware of this. The Russians have bent over backwards when they talk about a rules-based system. The Russians have bent over backwards to try and cooperate. You see, the language Putin is using are American friends. That's what he calls them. They don't call him their friend. They call him the worst thing since Hitler. But he still refers to them as our friends and partners. The Russians' language shows that they are the statesmen and that the Western leaders are basically pygmies. The danger of a confrontation over the Ukraine is enormous. But of course, it won't. The cookie won't necessarily crumble the way the warmongers want it to. Looks what's happened in East Ukraine. The Dad's army, because it really is locals who are providing most of the muscle, have thrashed the Kiev junta's forces. Because the Kiev junta's forces are made up of conscripts who don't want to fight, and far-right battalions funded by big oligarchs who are basically thugs. And we are actually implicated in all their thuggery. And ultimately, of course, I'm not a pacifist. I'm less of a pacifist than Rory Stewart. And ultimately, for example, if the British forces, British soldiers, go into East Ukraine where they've voted for independence from Kiev, they are going to be killed. And they will deserve to be killed, because ultimately I'm not a pacifist any more than anybody else is. If you come to my country to try and suppress my right to independence, I'm going to kill you. And that's what's going to happen to the West if they carry on down this road.
Now, we mentioned last week Sir John Sawyers, who's the former Director General of MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service's Foreign Intelligence Service, the old sort of James Bond service with the licence to kill abroad. And we've heard from the Defence Secretary Philip Hammond. We've also heard from the Chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Rory Stewart. Now let's hear from a former spook, the head of MI6, on the Russian threat.
Russia has always been an issue of concern for us. We had hoped in the 1990s that Russia and Europe was on a path of convergence with one another. We now know, because of the behaviour of Russia over the last 6 or 8 years, that is no longer the case. They are not converging with one another. Europe and Russia are not converging with one another. So we're going to have to find a new way to coexist with Russia. This crisis at the moment, it's focused on Ukraine, but Ukraine is a symptom. It's not the real problem. The real problem is how we live with a Russia which feels very exposed. Putin's actions are ones of a leader who believes his own security is at stake. And here we've got nuclear bombers approaching the Cornish coast. We've got threatening. It is a threat,
then. It is Russia is a danger to us in the West.
It certainly has become a danger.
How much of a danger?
Well, I think that the level of threat posed by Russia has increased, and we have to be prepared to take the defensive measures necessary to defend ourselves, defend our allies, which now extend as far as the Baltic states and Central Europe. And that's going to be a big issue, I think, in the Strategic Defence and Security Review after the election, because we clearly have, since the Cold War, run down our defence spending quite considerably as a proportion of GDP. The measure is not so much the percentage that we spend of national wealth on defence, but we've got to have the capability to deal with things like the hybrid warfare that we've seen Russia deploy, first in Crimea and then in the Donbass region. We've got to have the ability to deal with cyber warfare. There's a political importance attached to that 2%. But what's really important is that we are able to fulfil all our defence commitments, and I think that that's going to require a reversal in the trend in defence spending. We're going to have to spend more on our defence and security because the threats are greater, because we're living in a more dangerous world.
That was Sir John Sawyers there, who was the former Director General of MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, the Foreign Intelligence Service. Martin, he's talking there about this hybrid warfare. What does that mean?
Well, what he means is that, as I mentioned a moment ago, is that the volunteer battalions of the Novorossian army have thrashed the Ukrainian army, and they didn't expect that. That's because basically they're fighting for their country as they see it. They had a referendum in Donbass and Luhansk. They voted to be independent of Kiev, just like Slovenia voted to be independent of Yugoslavia, just like Kosovo voted to be independent of Serbia. And we actually went to war to give Kosovo independence from Serbia. The RAF and the USAF bombed Serbia and killed thousands of civilians to make them disgorge Kosovo, even though Kosovo was an integral part of the Serbian Republic under Tito. Now, the same thing has happened in Crimea and East Ukraine, because we overthrew the government in the West Ukraine, in Kiev. And now suddenly the West is saying, this is inadmissible, etc., etc. They have deliberately provoked the Russians because the military-industrial complex in the West wants our money, and they also want an excuse for the banking crash, which is just around the corner. It's very dangerous times. It's a good job the Russian leadership is as competent as they are, otherwise we'd already be over the waterfall into World War III.
Well, let's hear from one of the spokespeople of the criminal elite. I mean, he's a war criminal, a well-recorded war criminal. He's Henry Kissinger, and he had some advice this week for NATO.
NATO needs to develop a strategy for the future, and it should hold exercises that are relevant to the strategy and to what it is prepared to do. They should be doing it if they are convinced about their strategic purposes and if that exercise fits into it. The strategic purposes must be to defend and protect the territorial integrity of the members of NATO, and they have to develop strategies and capacities to meet this objective. They don't necessarily have to be at the precise point of attack, but they have to be relevant to it. They have found it difficult to accept the proposition that Cold War conditions may be returning, and secondly, because the vast majority of NATO governments have subordinated defense expenditures to domestic programs, and therefore they haven't had the capacity to develop a meaningful strategy to deal with a major attack. I think NATO has to develop military capacities that are relevant to dangers that they foresee. And if they are determined, as they should be, to resist further Russian military moves, it means that the defense limitations have to be lifted. Is it inevitable that we are in a Cold War strategy with Russia? I have had a view that at the beginning of the Ukrainian crisis, a more flexible diplomacy could have avoided many of the disasters that have befallen us, and probably protected a much larger area of Ukraine than has been the case. But at the point where we are now, I think it is essential that both Russia and NATO take a serious look at the diplomatic options, because if they fail, then I think a return to Cold War conditions is very likely.
Well, he's talking there about Cold War being inevitable, or strategy being inevitable, Martin.
Well, interestingly enough, some of the things that Kissinger has been saying is that we've backed Putin into a corner here, and we've overplayed our hand. We didn't get that from his rather Delphic pronouncement there. I would say it's not a Cold War, it's a hot war. It's already a hot war. I'm quite sure British mercenaries are fighting with the Kiev forces, with the advice of British military advisors, against people who are being advised by the Russians. People are dying. The Cold War was full of murder and mayhem. For the South Africans, as they destroyed Angola, Mozambique and other frontline states, were being supported by the West to destroy those countries. So that the Cold War was full of mayhem and murder. In Central America, up to hundreds of thousands of people were killed by the Western forces, and it's still going on.
In the background to all this, Putin is signing the law this week on the ratification of a $100 billion BRICS New Development Bank deal. This is basically saying bye-bye to the IMF.
Yeah, well, what's beginning to happen, because of the belligerent attitude since 9/11 of the Western elites, countries which were actually well disposed towards us. The Russian elite are wealthy capitalists. They would love to do business with the West, but the West basically has shafted them. So they're now turning away from doing business with us and looking for alternatives. And who can blame them? The people running the West are political pygmies. I've said it earlier. They are going to run us into a war on the back of this airy rhetoric, which is completely inappropriate. Look at the way the Russians are using language. They continually refer to our American partners, our British friends. What do? We go, "Yah, boo, sucks." It's pathetic.